Hello and welcome to the Nurse Rosa's Insights podcast. Today, I'm joined by two remarkable leaders who are transforming how patients access clinical trials, not just in theory, but in practice. First, Dr. Selin Kurnaz, the CEO and co-founder of MassiveBio. Selin has built a company that uses artificial intelligence and direct digital marketing to connect cancer patients with the right clinical trials, breaking down barriers of geography, cost, and awareness. Her work is redefining how patients discover opportunities that can extend and sometimes even save their lives. And joining her is Craig Lipset, co-founder and co-chair of the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance. Craig is a globally recognized thought leader and pioneer in decentralized clinical trials. He spent his career designing and scaling new models for patient-centered research, empowering participants to engage from their homes and communities rather than being tied only to academic medical centers. For nearly a decade, Craig was the head of clinical innovation at Pfizer, leading digital initiatives, patient engagement, and collaborations across all therapeutic areas around the globe, and currently serving, I believe, on the advisory board for Every Cure with Dr. David Fagenbaum. Is that right?
That is right, Rosa.
Yes. And so I am so excited to talk to both of you about making clinical trials better for humanity. First of all, Dr. Kurnaz, MassiveBio has been at the forefront of using AI and digital platforms matching patients. From your perspective, what is the single biggest innovation that will redefine how patients discover and enroll in clinical trials over the next 5 years or so?
I think there is more than single because of the complexity of what we are going through. I think the innovation in our way to define there are three layers. One of them is the innovation at the level of pre-screening. The other one is the innovation that needs to happen at patient identification. And then the third one is the innovation that needs to happen at the last mile, which is basically after a patient has been found fully eligible, how that patient is going to go into a site and continue their consenting and screening. So we have, as a company, have done, developments in these three areas. So, for example, prior to MassiveBio, when someone wants to be evaluated for a clinical trial with their medical records, they had to go through this thing one by one. And with the technology that we have developed right now, we have the ability to be able to pre-screen those patients with their medical records, with their molecular diagnostic testing to all clinical trials at clinicaltrials.gov in the matter of, and then, of course, there's all the human-related quality overview and so on and so forth. But, if you try to do that manually for all the clinical trials at clinicaltrials.gov, it takes more than 8 months. But if you try to do this thing at the leverage of AI, it's, you almost reduce the time amount of about more than 99%. So the other part is on the patient identification. So basically, how to make patients aware in terms of the availability of clinical trials, how to educate them and how to identify the target locations, as well as how to understand what is the time at which that the patient is more relevant for clinical trial options, so that developing some level of predictive modeling in terms of the progression patterns of those patients and managing their engagement. And then the third one is on the last mile side, which I call it is more like the supply chain aspect of the clinical trials. That includes three areas. One area is referring the patient to a site and setting up the screening appointment. The second one is trying to make sure that the patient has the appropriate travel and reimbursement. The pharmaceutical companies, in my perspective, are doing a great job after the patient signs the study consent and the patient is at the site. But the gap there is that before the patient signs the study consent, there's really no one that takes care of that patient. So we have to basically build the algorithms to make sure that there's a connectivity between the patient before the patient signs consent until the patient signs consent, so that this is not a deal breaker for the patient. And then the final part is on the insurance side, especially in the United States, if it's an in-state, out-of-state, what kind of insurance that the patient has, and does the patient is going to get into any kind of an out of pocket cost, and how we can navigate that journey. Of course, these things takes time, and in order to be able to reduce that time with the advancement of artificial intelligence, we are going into agentic AI, having these maybe agents having the first conversation with the patient until it's being escalated to a human. All these kind of things need to combine together in order to be able to unlock the potential in the world of clinical trials. But I would like to make a little bit of a disclaimer. Every comment that I'm making in here is based on cancer patients, because my company is still, I think I met with Craig long years ago. The one thing, frankly, that has not changed in the journey of MassiveBio is our significant obsession to support cancer patients. And all the comments that I make in here is all about the journey of a cancer patient, either the patients that are in the solid tumors or heme malignancies.
Yes. And that's an important disclaimer because there are clinical trials for all kinds of different things. Like,
Right.
Craig, I think your focus has been mostly based on your sarcoidosis journey. Is that right?
Well, it's actually my origin story in research, Rosa, I think is similar to yours. You work in a stroke unit, is that right?
Well, I worked in stroke ICU for 8 years. And then the last 5 years, I've been making patient phone calls after stroke. So, yes.
So my research career actually started in acute stroke as well.
Really?
Up at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center, I worked on the Northern Manhattan Stroke Study with Ralph Sacco. And I know that you had mentioned doing some work with the University of Miami. And
Yeah.
obviously, Ralph was a force in the research ecosystem and a great loss that we had with his passing. But I certainly was incredibly grateful to the opportunities that he gave me as a young professional
Yes.
entering the field, and really gave me the autonomy to really have the confidence to do what I do today. I went from there into industry and was ultimately over there at Pfizer, but then in parallel had my own experience as a patient in a rare indication called sarcoidosis. And I think that while my research work in clinical trials today is across therapeutic areas, I work in rare and oncology and other more gen med indications. Um, my my appreciation for the empowered role of a patient today is largely based on that experience in rare. And much of my career has kind of come full circle, as now I'm working on a number of newer models for nonprofit drug development in ultra rare indications. And I look forward to chatting more about what that future looks like to fill this gap where we have families with unmet medical need. We have science that tells us there are molecules that could serve them, but we don't have commercial models to be
Mm.
able to move those molecules into the clinic, because the quite honestly, if biopharma came in the way that they traditionally do, the cost would break society in
Mm.
terms of what reimbursement would have to look like. And so how do we rethink some of our models to support these neglected ultra rare indications?
Yeah, and that's what the Every Cure is working on, right? Is using already established medications for off-label use.
So every cure is absolutely doing that. And David Feigenbaum, who you mentioned earlier, is absolutely brilliant with his team that he's put together around repurposing existing molecules for unmet medical need. The appreciation that the drugs that are on our medicine shelves in our pharmacies can do more good than the good they're already doing. And how can we leverage artificial intelligence to create this incredible matching superpower to consume the science of these different indications and help to rank order and prioritize which molecules might do good for other indications. But there are plenty of other indications where there may not be something that's on the shelf already that could serve those. And so we have investigational new medicines that can support many of these rare and ultra rare indications, some of which are genetically defined indications, where we know a gene therapy and antisense oligonucleotides, some other molecule could make an impact for those children and their families. But where the traditional models of biopharmaceutical drug development, which have worked incredibly well for 95% of patients out there, it's just when we start to reach into these rare and ultra rare indications, the models don't work. And so what we're seeing is the rise of patient and parent led nonprofit organizations that have been advancing molecules to the clinic with the belief that in doing so, pharma would come along if it's IND ready, if it's ready for a phase 1 trial. But pharma hasn't, and they're probably not going to because
Right.
the economics just don't make sense. And so these incredibly resourceful parents who've become drug hunters and drug developers are now bringing those molecules into phase 1 and 2 clinical trials themselves through their nonprofits. And we have examples in our ecosystem like the Fox G1 Foundation and the Test Foundation and others that are doing exactly that. They're not launching biotech companies. They're using their existing nonprofit entities to move these molecules into clinical trials. Now, why can we do that today is in some ways part of our conversation about AI, right? Because once upon a time, only a large, well-funded pharma or biotech company could make that happen. You needed special talent, special tools, and a lot of money. And today, in large part because of AI and other innovations, talent is widely democratized. The tools to run these studies are highly democratized. And when we can bring the cost of drug development down, you no longer need to have access to extraordinary volumes of capital in order to make this happen. One group that I've been working with as a nonprofit recently is called the Buffalo Initiative. And as much as I love David and what he's doing with Every Cure, Sunitha Malapati and what she's doing with Buffalo is equally inspiring with innovative new drugs, just like with what David is doing with those repurposed drugs, creating that scalable platform and fund so that nonprofit organizations like Fox G1 and Test can do what they're doing, even in more extraordinary scale, so that others can follow and not have to relearn what those organizations have had to go through to get their molecules where they are.
That is amazing. And is that part of your decentralization alliance?
It's not affiliated with DTRA. DTRA, the Decentralized Trials Research Alliance, is a fabulous nonprofit community of 50, 60, 70 organizations around the world, regulators, pharma, tech companies, service providers, health systems, focused on improving access. When groups like the Buffalo Initiative and these other ultra rare initiatives to move molecules into the clinic deploy their studies, they will most certainly take advantage of decentralized elements in how they do their work. For many of them, they've been running very innovative approaches for natural history studies and otherwise, already using those types of decentralized elements. As parents, they know the burden on them and their families associated with having to transport very ill children a tremendous distance just in order to have access to research participation.
That's right. And then Selin and Craig, did you guys work together in like the oncology space, or how do you two know each other?
Actually went and visited Craig in Pfizer long years ago in the
Oh,
Pfizer's previous headquarter location.
okay.
I tend to be a little promiscuous, Rosa, and I love meeting entrepreneurs and people that are, investing their own energy and their own time to solve challenges in our space. And one of the reasons, as I worked at Pfizer and beyond, that I do that is if folks are going to invest capital and energy to solve a challenge, we have to, in industry, we have to be able to articulate to them and make that some level of investment in return so that they can better understand the challenges and problems that we're facing. But Selena is kind of special out there. She's one of those entrepreneurs that when you meet her, you know that she's going to crush something. And it may not be exactly what it looks like when you first meet her, but you know that she has this incredible focus and drive and determination that she is going to solve a problem that is meaningful. It just not may not be with the tools when you first meet her because she will make the
It
adjustment she's
changed drastically from the time that we had discussed. I think we're in version 3.0,
right?
what we
But
had
like you
discussed.
said, still laser focused on the challenge. You didn't drift over and say, "Oh, now we're
Yeah,
a company that does something, a
right.
completely different use case." You're still going after an incredibly meaningful challenge. Rosa, as Celine was describing earlier, this recruitment funnel for patients, this whole process has so much leakage and dysfunction, right? For how we try to build trust and engage with patients on the front end, straight through to this process of helping a patient to understand, do they just match for the one study that I as as a study team are trying to push in front of patients, or do they match for other trials that may actually be better for them or closer to home for them? And if those don't have a big recruitment budget, how are we being ethical and responsible in helping to present all of the right options for a given patient and their family, help them make those determinations? And then for the researchers, helping to make sure that we can be timely and responsible in turning around back to them by understanding the patient's medical data. That lag time of chart reviews and the legacy ways Selin was describing contributes to so much dropout and leakage in this very dysfunctional process.
And there's just not time for that lag time. I mean, so many of these, especially cancers, can be rapid growing. They don't have that time to wait. Like my mentor in stroke, Lynn Hunley, passed away. It's publicly known as glioblastoma. And she actually donated her brain to science in order to help other people. But it was so rapid. It was just months. There wasn't as much available like 2 years ago as there is now. I know there are some great research studies being done at Barrow Neurological Institute in Arizona, for example. Selin, I don't know if you've partnered with them directly or anything, but they have a really interesting program I wanted to ask you about. I don't know how common this is, where they'll have patients in a phase 0 trial. They'll advance into a therapeutic study arm only if the drug has an effect on their tumor. And if the drug isn't working, the patient can then switch to another therapy without losing time or options. So I'm really excited about options like that for people who just, they don't have time to like be in a placebo and not get a chance to get better. So now I think MassiveBio is connected with the American Cancer Society. So if someone gets a new cancer diagnosis and they don't know really where to go and they go to American Cancer Society's website, they can connect with MassiveBio there and start the process, right?
Yeah, I can basically describe a little bit about how we're actually finding the patients. So there
Yeah.
are two mega ways that we're finding the patients. One a mega way is direct to patient. And in that direct to patient, there are three sublayers. One sublayer is finding the patient through patient advocacy group, the largest one being the American Cancer Society, which we are super grateful for the opportunity to partner with American Cancer Society. But we basically partner with about 416 patient advocacy groups globally. The
Wow.
second area is about like 130 strategic partnerships. So these partnerships are from molecular diagnostic companies to specialty pharmacies to payer prior authorization unit, because no one can solve this thing alone. You have to go through these large buckets of databases of patients and get their help to do the initial filtering of those patients so that we can go into more deeper details of the medical records and the molecular diagnostic testing. And there is that 130 strategic partnerships. And then the other way is our digital engagement efforts with community formation using the social media platform, advertisement, and some of the other layers in order to make sure that the patients are aware, and even being a part of this kind of podcast to create awareness about the master screening for cancer patients. So that's kind of one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum is what we call it as indirect to patients. So basically engaging patients through their physicians. In the indirect, there are two models. One model is that if we are hired to a particular clinical trial, or if we need to find patients for a particular clinical trial, we also get the site list for that trial. And then we go into the physicians within the 50 to 100-mile radius of those sites that potentially has the patient that could potentially be eligible for these trials, and educate those physicians about the availability of the trial and how we can support them for free for pre-screening their patients so that they can identify if those patients could potentially be eligible for the trial. And, in order to make this thing process entertaining for the potentially referring physician, we also do roundtables, lunch and learn events, create almost like a community, because especially in the United States, there's this anxiety from the medical oncology, I don't want to give my patient. Because when the patient goes into another institution, that's a loss of revenue, and we all know that. So, and because the mechanisms are misaligned in terms of putting the patient into a clinical trial versus what the the oncologists are practicing in their daily lives. So in order to have a soft landing on that, so we are trying to make sure that they're a part of the community. And there is no, way of taking the patient and running away. It's actually keeping the patient as much as possible with the treating oncologist and also bringing back the patient to the original practice where the patient has been, started their care after the clinical trial process is complete. And then the second part is, having some business associate agreement and mining the MR of certain hospitals systems to do these bulk layer of pre-screenings at scale. But keep in mind that these kind of, BAAs going through the major privacy and security processes of these hospitals take significant amount of time. The earliest that you can do is in 9 months, it's typically sometimes 12 months, 15 months, 18 months. And as you were saying, the patients cannot wait. Yeah. Since the patients cannot wait, we have to go through these other models that has a little bit of a more time sensitivity, going to direct the patient or going to the individual physicians and giving them more like an application for them to be able to start an individual pre-screening process instead of fully waiting for these hospital and the hospital level systems that can happen. The other thing that we have done, which I'm very proud, is that, so for example, when a cancer patient, we are working in 17 countries. Let's take the example of the United States. When a cancer patient comes to MassiveBio, if the cancer patient is getting their treatment from Epic or Cerner, and if they use our Patient Connect application, we have developed APIs to Epic and Cerner so that we can do a real-time download of their medical records after, of course, they provide the consent, so that they don't have to wait obtaining those medical records. They don't get lost. So once we have those medical records, we also do a request for the molecular diagnostic testing. And if they're not tested, then we help to facilitate the testing for those patients so that they get the results and then it's being used for either for their standard of care or their clinical trial options, but try to minimize these operational inefficiencies for data, acquisition so that we get more real-time data. Because if you try to do a manual request for a medical records to an institution, it takes bare minimum 2 days. And if you're working in a not so cooperative institution, it can even take 2 weeks. So think about, like in order to be able for your medical record to be obtained, you have to wait for 2 weeks for that medical record to arrive. And after that medical record to arrive, God forbid, if you don't have the molecular diagnostic testing, then you need to wait another X number of weeks in order to get that testing. So that process becomes longer and longer. And it's unacceptable for a cancer patient to go through that level of time frame to get. And one of the other things that I am also a big advocate is that, unfortunately, you cannot go and think about the standard of care patient workflow and try to force fit a clinical trial patient. So we have to design new workflows for patients that has more, relevance in terms of participating into clinical trials, so that we basically don't say, okay, we do the same results, we do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. So there is also workflow change that you need to do, especially when, since the pharma, for example, is going a lot of on the, the first line trials, which has, especially from a patient recruitment standpoint, has increased significantly in the last 12 months. You're not going to find that first line patient traditional medical oncologist, because when that patient comes to a medical oncologist, the medical oncologist is going to have a different plan of action. So you go into a pulmonologist. So basically a physician 1 layer before or 2 layers before the medical oncologist. So you have to take into consideration about these workflow changes or engineer or re-engineer the workflow of the patient journey. You need to bring the AI, you need to bring the scale, but also you have to close the loop with the appropriate customer service so that the patients get the level of support. Not only the patients, frankly, also the treating oncologist and the site staff gets the appropriate support to close the loop from the identification to enrollment.
Yeah, this is incredible. This is so much more than just matching this profile with this trial. It sounds like you're really helping patients navigate their cancer journey in an expedited fashion, whether or not they're matched or before they get a chance to even be matched.
Well, here's the thing yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I wanted to say you're being very optimistic, I would think, with the 2 weeks for medical records. I mean, I've heard from some patients it takes months for them. And maybe it's because they have a hard time even figuring out how to put in that request that you're talking about. So I'm hearing that you're providing a lot of value in just navigating the health system on the front end before even getting to the clinical trial match part.
Yeah, I can tell you that if you ask me what is the easiest process in the clinical trial matching, the clinical trial matching itself is the easiest.
Right.
Once you have the medical records, molecular diagnostic testing, and the structuring of the clinical trials.gov inclusion exclusion criteria with the support of technology, you can match that. It's more like a technology problem, and it has been solved, and it will be even solved better. That is the easiest problem to solve. But the biggest issue is, okay, how to find the right and relevant patient, what kind of an ecosystem that you need to choose, because, like there are two layers. It's the EMR as well as the payers. So it's, you either need to buy all the EMRs in the entire planet in order to be able to get access to all these patients, or you need to go and form these multi pact with all the payers on the planet. So I don't have the financial capability to do one or the other. Then you go into these more like a mini partners, which has fairly large in size, but different pockets of patients, and try to figure out, okay, which patient population works with X type of trials. And then you do your magic in these master pre-screening, and then the holy grail starts, which is the last mile. Does this trial closer to the patient? Does this patient have the right insurance? Does the patient have even tested for biomarker based testing for in order to go into some kind of precision medicine treatment? Those are the things I can tell you that takes between 97 to 99% of the time, as opposed to the clinical trial matching process itself.
Rosa, when I think about this space,
Mhm.
most in industry will say that enrollment of patients tends to be the biggest challenge to completing a study, is finding the patients to enroll in the study, which seems paradoxical because clearly companies running these trials believe there are patients that exist to receive the commercialized medicine. And
Right.
so why is there this mismatch? We're running studies struggling to enroll patients, where on the other hand, we're assuming that when this drug is approved, there are enough patients out there for that underlying medicine that it will be commercially sustainable. The
Mhm.
mismatch is serendipity. The mismatch is that we're running studies at a predefined investigator site, and in order for most patients to learn about a trial, they have to have the serendipity that they happen to be at the right doctor who happens to be an investigator in the trial that was right for them. And only then, in most cases, will that patient learn about a clinical trial. When we
Yeah.
look at data, and there's data that this group, CISGRIP, publishes, they just put out their most recent data a few minutes ago.
A
CISGRIP
few
is
minutes
the
ago.
Center for Information on the Study of Clinical Research Participation. Year after year, we see the same. Patients want to learn about research from their doctor. They don't want to have to go to the internet, but that's where the overwhelming majority of patients will learn about it. And in large part, it's, as Selin mentioned, it's because of these misaligned incentives. If
Mm.
I'm a provider who's providing care for this patient, why would I want to send them away from my local community practice to that big academic center? I have options. I'm an oncologist, I'm a neurologist, whatever my field is. I have options for this patient. Why would I send them away? Especially in a fee for service healthcare system, why would I send them away? Now, I will say that the FDA saw this problem as well. And last year, the FDA introduced one final guidance document and one draft guidance document that start to chip away at this. And I'm really excited about both of these guidance documents. In the final guidance from FDA last fall on decentralized trials, the FDA introduced this concept that healthcare providers can perform the routine care activities in a clinical trial protocol without being an investigator and without being a sub investigator. There's this piece of paper that we fill out for all of our investigators called the 1572. It's
Well,
basically the sheet of paper that FDA inspectors pick up when they say, where am I going to go today? And most doctors don't want to be listed on a 1572 if they're not an investigator site. And so this clarification means that when there's routine care procedures in a study protocol, the patient can stay with that local provider in the community. And we know in the case of oncology, over half of patients see local community oncologists. While
Yeah.
this guidance document wasn't written for oncology, we know that the leaders in the Oncology Center of Excellence at FDA were all over it and putting their mark on it. In addition to that, final guidance was a draft guidance called Randomized Trials in Routine Care Settings that really goes even further and makes clear that routine care procedures, not just a blood draw and a blood pressure check, but if that clinical setting, if those providers are performing biopsies or other procedures in a routine basis, that's fine for them to do that in the context of a trial. And so all of a sudden, we can start to fix some of the misaligned incentives, the fears of leakage and losing patients, and start to really create these platform opportunities for healthcare providers and local communities to no longer fear that a clinical trial means I'm losing my patient.
Well, and I think that harkens back to what Celine was saying about creating that communities and building that trust amongst providers across systems. Like my altruism wants to say, well, don't you want the patient to live to follow up with you next year? As far as like if you're afraid of losing the patient, but maybe this clinical trial is their best shot at surviving, right?
And for
But
most studies, we're hoping not to just enroll the patient who's, unfortunately at that state of progression. We're hoping also to be able to engage and enroll people at earlier stages of their
yeah,
illness. By the way, I should mention DTRA, the Decentralized Trials Research Alliance. We've been generating insights data with different types of specialists to and primary care docs, both nurse practitioners and physicians, to understand what they think about supporting routine care. What are the barriers or concerns that they have so that we can make sure that, just as you and Celine were saying, we kind of have all stakeholders getting engaged. For most trials, we just think about our investigators and our study participants. Their treating doc in the community, we've kind of left behind without a seat at this table. I think now we're creating that seat.
that is so important. And I mean, on the one hand, I know physicians and nurse practitioners of all specialties probably feel like they don't have the bandwidth to like learn a new specialty to lead a clinical trial. So for them to just be able to participate in this way that's really not outside of their routine is going to be really important. So Celine, were you going to say something? It looked like your wheels were turning.
Yeah, I think what I was basically going to say is that, if you think about the community oncologist that is potentially going to refer a patient to a clinical trial, we're not talking about, taking 75% of their practice. These are, like there's a pretty small number of patients that you're talking about. And, my co-founder, he's also a community oncologist, and he says, if you basically come to me, if you don't come to me and ask me, if I want to refer a patient to this, I don't even recognize if that patient is
Right.
even coming to my practice or not. But when you come and ask me to get almost like permission to refer the patient to a clinical trial, then I get entitled to, hold on to that patient and not letting the patient to go anywhere. So I think I just wanted to, in terms of the order of magnitude, we are not saying that, like we are basically taking the entire practice and sending it to a large academic medical cancer center or a location where the clinical trial is located. We're still looking for a fairly, negligible number of patients that needs to be evaluated for the option of referral for a clinical trial. And my, hope is, at the end of the day, at some point in time that every hospital or every institution becomes a quasi clinical trial site that everyone has able to be able to get that clinical trial in their own institution. But by then, we cannot like stop right now, and we have to proceed.
There are a couple of interesting like companies and models, Rosa, for your audience to be aware of.
Mhm.
If you are a clinician in practice and you want to get involved in clinical research, but like you said, the burden, the staffing, the familiarity is just kind of daunting. There
Yeah.
are companies out there, they fall under this banner in our lexicon as researchers of integrated research organizations, IROs. I'm on the board for one called Circuit Clinical. There are others out there with names like Javara or Eligo. And these are the types of organizations that can work with a private practice or a medical group and help them to build research competency using some of their own infrastructure, but without necessarily having to relearn and reinvent the staffing, the processes, and the tools to be a research site. And then in parallel are some other companies that are a little more focused on that next level of, I don't think I want to be an investigator, but I wouldn't mind if my patients are participating and I could support routine care activities alone, maybe have the investigator connect in by video. And there are
Yeah.
companies out there like MedVector or others that kind of focus in that lane. So there's like a nice emerging ecosystem of support for those medical centers. As Celine said, it would be great to see more be able to engage, but I don't think we'd ever reach a point of saturation where every medical center has every trial available for every patient. And so we still need these ways that we can do right by patients, even if the best study for them is running across the street. How do I still feel like I'm not losing my patient in order for them to participate over there?
Yeah, definitely. And I wanted to ask you as well, because like in your TED talk, Craig, you shared about the importance of sharing your health data and that most people, 90%, are willing to share their health data based on like the wearable devices, whether it's a Aura ring or I guess even a Fitbit, right? So where are you at with that now? Because that was like back a decade ago when you made that TED talk. So are you able to incorporate data like that into some of these clinical trials you're talking about?
Sometimes you go out there and you put out an idea on a video and you wonder, hey, maybe I won't be in this industry long enough to have to live with the consequences or still believe or disbelieve in what I said there. And in this case, I'm very relieved to say I still firmly stand by everything I said a decade ago in that TED talk, which was really themed, as you said, on the disruption that patients will bring when they are increasingly empowered with access to their own health data, their willingness to share that data for medical research. Medical research runs very deeply on data,
Yes.
both de-identified real-world data that's used for natural history studies for understanding baseline information on populations, as well as data that we collect from discrete individual patients who opt in and consent to participate in a prospective clinical trial. In both of those cases, there is this painful ecosystem of trying to collect data about me as an individual, about me as a patient. The best source for that data is me. I have access to this entire connected ecosystem of different places where my data lives. And whether I'm using apps like Apple Health or Guava or some of the other tools out there for patients today, the point being that I know where my data is and I can connect it and I can share it. And some are making that even easier for me, right? Whether you love or hate Epic and my chart and Epic did announce that there will be a single sign on for patients agnostic to different health systems, which
Yes.
will tackle a nice frustration that I have as a patient, right?
Oh,
Managing all my different my chart accounts. Nevertheless, the ones that run on Athena or God knows wherever else my data is. The point
right.
being that when we can engage with a patient to share their data, you will get much more rich and diverse data. You can get patient reported outcomes from those individuals as well. And that's where we start to see next generation registries and natural history studies, ones that aren't just saying, can I reach in and grab somebody's de-identified data without their knowledge, but the types of studies that engage with me and let me know that you're running a study and care about my data and invite me to connect and share that, because the breadth of data you will get is far more rich.
Definitely. And if you have not heard of it, you should hear about primary record, which is it kind of aggregates all of that electronic health information from all the different ones like Epic, Cerner, in one place where families can have access to it and interact with it, the AI and the platform, to just ask it questions and it answer from their own personal health record. So I think it would really be up your alley. You
I
should
think
definitely.
platforms like that, Citizen, even Verily Me that they launched, when we were over in Vegas, all these platforms that are helping me to consume my data and now adding agents on top of it. I
Yes.
was looking online at the agents that Citizen has added for patients, where it can generate letters to dispute a denial of a claim or generate letters
Yes.
to help you in terms of navigating prior auth,
Yeah.
the real pain points that patients and their providers are navigating. And by layering, access to my data with tools that matter to me. It's pretty exciting to see where it goes. The caveat, of course, is I want to know where my data is going. And so I'm hoping that our ecosystem is doing a good job of weeding out the actors whose sole play is it's almost this game that some had existed on of I'm going to get guys like Craig to share their data on my platform and then I'm going to monetize the hell out of it behind their back. And in places like oncology and others, the financial consequences of that diagnosis can be devastating. And to imagine that their health data is used without their knowledge to be monetized is.
Well, what I see is that so patients don't have a lot of hesitation in order to be able to share their data. But I think, as Craig also was saying, the hesitation was around how that data is going to be used and what is the value proposition of that data to that individual patient and the other patients of alike. So that's kind of the part that we see significantly in our onboarding to our patient contact center, especially the patients in the United States are pretty open of sharing their data.
Yeah. And I think it can be really impactful for people to see how it affects them directly. So now both of you are shaping the future of trial access. If you had to design the ideal patient engagement journey together, since I know you like to work together, from the first moment of outreach to trial completion, what would that look like to you? And how would technology, empathy, and trust each play a role in that process?
So I think what I would say is that, first of all, like I need to be aware of this clinical trial or whatever the, like the use case that I'm going to be involved in. And it needs to be accessible. So frankly, the way how I envision the future is that I even, there are certain things that, especially in the people in the United States they go into a supermarket, they go into a gas station and all that stuff. So I even want the patients to be get educated in these, you know, the locations where they go every day in their lives. It doesn't have to be, sophisticated healthcare facility. Wherever that I
Yes.
go, I wanted to make sure that there is a way that I can feel or I can understand and I can basically see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel in my life, in my healthcare journey. So that has to be very important for me. The second thing is that it needs to be invisible in my life in order to make something work in healthcare. Because if I have to go into 25 different platforms, if I have to spend so much time, because at the end of the day, I'm talking about a cancer patient that has their own challenges in that journey and they need to focus on their health as opposed to the process. So, as long as it is interconnected, as long as it is extremely simple, as long as it is technology oriented, that this thing that we are trying to do in terms of the clinical trial access does not lead to additional work, complexity, and everything combined in my life. I think that's the environment that I wanted to build. Very invisible. It's almost integrated in their life. Also, it has to be democratized because the thing is that, for example, prior to MassiveBio, we were seeing that the patient recruitment was based on a particular trial so that patients are evaluated for this trial, that trial. One of the
Yeah.
things that I'm trying to unlock with the, leverage of the MassiveBio is that the patient needs to be because you do not want it to force fit a patient to a certain trial. Like you basically have the patient at the center and then you evaluate that patient to any trial if it's like 14,000, 19,000 trials, especially in the world of that's actively recruiting in the world of oncology. And we have actually a study that we have done with Precision Cancer Consortium, how much of an increase in enrollment that can be achieved if you relax the assumption of force fitting a patient to a single trial versus, you match those patients to any trial that's actively recruiting at clinicaltrials.gov. So that democratization that needs to happen. And then the last part, which is also, which I am like super passionate about, the frankly, that no one wants to work in that area, which I'm working on it because if you do not close the last mile for the patient, you lose 75% of the patients. And if there's a molecular diagnostic requirement, you lose 90% of the patients. So that we need to automate that supply chain part of a perfect patient, a unicorn patient that has been fully eligible for the clinical trial criteria. that patient either has to go to a site, or that patient needs to make sure that whatever the clinical trial that's available in their own institution is ready for that patient to attend. I'm even going through, instances where we call a particular site, but the site is not even aware if that trial is open in
Right.
their own, institution. And you almost need to convince the clinical research, associate that that trial is there. So these are very unfortunate realities that we have to go through.
So
That
true.
the level of connectivity from an eligibility to operational feasibility is where I dream, starting from a, like almost like a retail that, everywhere the cancer patient goes, there has to be a way to get access to those patients. Then going into these master pre-screenings, giving the democratization of the cancer patients, and then closing the loop and making this thing as invisible, as scaled, and as less invasive to a patient so that they can continue their life while they're getting the benefit of participating into these fairly sophisticated clinical trials.
That is so important. And I'm glad to hear it's not just me. Like, we talk about people being siloed in their areas, but like you're describing, people in the same silo don't know what each other are doing. And so facilitating that communication, I feel like, is the hardest part. So, how can you help people communicate within their own departments? Have you figured that out yet?
Well, I don't think that there's a secret sauce to figure that out, but it's almost even like an old school. You have to almost go and knock every door,
Pretty
in
much.
order to be able to, bring people. But of course, with the advancement of technology, it doesn't have to be, manual and physical visits. But at
Mhm.
the same time, it has to be still one by one to a certain extent, because I see large institutions, and in that large institution, fairly well respected physician, they may not even know which clinical trial that their institution has. So it's almost like luck that you go into this physician, you go into this clinical trial, versus you go into another physician, you don't get the opportunity and knowledge and experience to go into that clinical trial. It's like fairly unfortunate in my perspective.
Agreed.
You know,
And Craig,
a
what
fair
would your
amount of
ideal? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
a fair amount of that communication challenge, though, is also it also trickles back to this misaligned incentives. Um, if I was on the board for one particular research institution and we started to experiment with filling the gap if one academic provider sends a patient to be in another academic provider's study, because even within that institution, there is loss in doing that, or the perception of loss or the reality of loss. And so, how do we keep that other provider whole? Right? So that they don't feel the loss, whether in terms of the number of patients on their books, because they're all being held accountable, not to how many
Yes.
patients I referred, but to RVUs, right? And how much in terms of productivity I'm generating. And sending a patient down the hall doesn't help. It hurts. And so institutions have to look at that, like we were doing in this one example, to explore how to keep our providers whole. They shouldn't be penalized for doing what's right. But when I think about this kind of future state, first off, fabulous perspective there, Selin. I completely agree on this message of frictionless. Patients trust their providers. They go to their providers to have shared decision making around treatment options. Clinical research needs to be presented at that time. And it should be a part of the clinical decision support infrastructure that we're already building and standing up for our providers based on their patients' medical data at the point of care. The reason that's so important in areas like oncology, for example, once a prescription is written and a patient goes down a certain path, it starts to change the landscape of what trials for which they may be eligible. And so it really needs to be factored in and factored in upfront. But as
Yes.
Selene pointed out, it needs to be democratized. It shouldn't just be the choice of these 3 approved medicines or the one trial that I happen to know is taking place in the office next door. And so this is where these opportunities that supporting routine care and keeping your patients create these pathways that how can I present all trials? It doesn't matter if it's a Merck sponsored trial at the institution across the street, a Pfizer sponsored trial on the floor downstairs. I'm keeping my patient. I'm keeping the routine care aspects. They're only leaving me for certain aspects of the protocol that are unique and not routine care. And so I think that aspect of building this in as a part of how research and care become integrated becomes how these processes become less disruptive and more invisible. But to me, the holy grail that I'm drinking the Kool-Aid on is this future of digital twins that are AI powered, this future where the best clinical trial for me is one that nobody had to participate in, certainly not in the placebo arm, and maybe even fewer in the active arm. Nobody wants to be in a trial. They're there for hope. And how can we accelerate that by running studies with synthetic patients, running virtual trials, using our existing natural history data to lessen the burden of patients having to be in trials at all? The one stakeholder involved in clinical research who embraces their obsolescence are the patients themselves. Everyone else is getting paid to be there. They're the ones that have to be there. And so they will be the ones that fight the least when technology comes to replace them in a positive way, right? If we can run more studies in these types of synthetic cohorts using digital instances of me with full transparency that you're using my data in this way, there will still be a need to introduce investigational medicines in humans. But think of all of the virtual trials that will already have been done with these types of synthetic patients and data along the way.
Now, Craig, I didn't get to attend your panel at Health. I wanted to, but where are we at with digital twins and these synthetic trials? Is that something that's coming or is it being done somewhere?
Where we're seeing the use of these types of digital twins today, and when I describe a digital twin, think about being able to use all of my real world data, but all of the real world data of other patients around me so that we can try to model and simulate how I would progress or what types of outcomes I may have otherwise had in different scenarios. And we can imagine digital twins in a number of places, whether it's how I'm planning and designing my studies using synthetic versions of me. Could I be a digital twin? Could I be the control arm in my own study? And could I start to envision using modeling and simulation how I might respond to different medicines along the way? Now, regulators have been presented with these types of models, both in the US and in Europe, and have generally been pretty friendly to this idea. But their use case has been really, limited right now more to study design and planning. That being said, we do see the use of synthetic control arms in many oncology studies. Synthetic control arms meaning that I can supplement the number of patients that I have in a control arm using other patients' real world data and EMR data. And so, can I lessen the number of patients in the control arm because most people don't want to be in the control arm? And, it's mostly natural history data anyway. I needed to reduce some sense of bias. To me, I think one of the places I'm very excited about digital twins will be in rare. Even though it's a little harder to get the breadth of real world data to do this type of modeling, the regulators have already told us that self controlled studies are what they're expecting going forward. The idea that I can use run in data about me to serve as my own control. And so, if I can do that, how can I then start to use other natural history data and otherwise to start to see not only my own control based on my run-in data, but based on modeling how I might have progressed over time otherwise. So
That is
watch this space, Rosa. I think it's going to be an exciting one.
Well, definitely. And then, so if someone is listening to this and they're a provider of some kind and they want to be able to partner to send to their patients to participate in clinical trials, Craig, let me follow up on Selin's got this whole path laid out here with MassiveBio. If you are in the oncology space, is there anything like that for rare diseases or anything to match people up?
Well, like Selin was saying, sometimes the matching part's the easy part in terms of
Yeah.
having those engines. There are young companies that are starting up. I saw one announcement from one that a patient actually had started, Stevie Ringle, a company called Gnome that's using molecular and clinical data, more advanced diagnostics data to help patients in rare diseases, ultra rare, to try to match backwards and understand, is there an ASO or some other, very innovative strategy that I should be pursuing for my child based on my data. But I think the challenge we have in rare is, as uncommon as we hope oncology is, we're talking in many cases some very small populations in some of these ultra rare indications, sub
Yeah.
1,000 patients. And in fact, we're also talking at the same time about now recognizing that there are over 10,000 rare diseases. And so we have this, I think, this need to start to cluster some of these diseases. It may be a discrete mutation, but if the kids are presenting similar enough in terms of the types of outcome measures, looking at seizure, cognition, communication, movement, can we start to cluster these more efficiently on master protocols as kind of bundled studies, which is something that we're pursuing right now in that nonprofit effort, the Buffalo Initiative, to try to cluster, in our case, these neurogenetic indications. There's just too many to tackle. And I think we can create efficiencies by bundling some together.
So if someone is, and back to MassiveBio, Selin, if there is someone listening who works in oncology, or sometimes my stroke patients also have a cancer diagnosis, for example, like, are there any hoops they have to jump through in order to like access that information about through MassiveBio as far as what clinical trials are available, or can they just like go to massivebio.com and search for their diagnosis?
Yeah, so they can simply go to massivebio.com. There's a very easy way to sign up to massivebio.com. Once they sign up, we start the process, and then they will be evaluated for any trial that's actively recruiting at clinical trials. With a disclaimer that we're only covering for oncology and heme malignancy patients. And even if you're a physician, you don't even need to be a cancer patient. Even if you are a physician, there's a section in our website where a physician can get support for free pre-screening for their patients, because we understand that they have very busy days.
Exactly, exactly. So thank you so much, both of you, for the work that you are doing to demystify this process. I am going to ask you my $1 billion question that I ask every guest on the Nurse Rosa's Insights podcast. I waited about an hour later for you guys than everybody else because you're already doing so much. I had to hear about it. But this is your opportunity to spit out any other ideas you don't have time or capacity or anything to focus on, since we've already heard what you're working on. If you were given a grant for $1 billion to meet a need that you see in healthcare, how would you like to see it used strategically to have the most sustainable impact?
I think what I would do is that I will actually invest in patient journey, because, like today we have discussed more around the world of clinical trials, but there are more than clinical trials in the patient journey, matching those patients to drugs, matching patients to these observational studies. So there's so much that can be done. And there are two objective functions for that. One objective function is to improve the outcome of that individual patient and how we can help that patient's journey so that they can increase their life quality as well as the time that they, continue their lives. And then the second one is that how that journey can be evaluated for the support for the next generation of patients, so that the next generation of the patients don't go into the difficulties that the current patients are going through. So there is these two objective functions. And unfortunately, right now, there is lack of accountability. Whose job is that, to get that patient journey and try to really understand that patient journey and increase the outcome of that patient journey, looking at into different, modalities and trying to take that to the level of global.
Yes.
So, since that job is not clearly assigned to a one stakeholder, two stakeholders, like also at the end of the day, pharmaceutical companies have their own biases in terms of promoting those drugs to their a certain type of patient population. I think there needs to be a I think pharma or non-X organization that is taking this thing, which is going to fundamentally unlock the future of the patient care as an assignment. There needs to be an investment on this. And then that investment needs to help, I'm a little bit biased starting from the cancer patients globally, so that because every time you try to do these things and it never gets into a scale, because of that reason, there's a lot of companies that die along the way. So you need money for scale, but of course the, purposeful use of that money in a non-biased environment, which is, I think, that could be very helpful to invest in that patient journey from the beginning to the end to provide the better outcomes of an individual patient and beyond. That is what I would do if I have that money, and hopefully I'll get there one day.
Right. Well, I appreciate your laser focus in the meantime. You got to be focused to accomplish things. So, Craig, how would you use $1 billion grant strategically?
Rosa, last year, the FDA approved 50 new drugs. We have over 10,000 rare and ultra-rare diseases. The existing biopharmaceutical, biotechnology industry is great, but it will never address these rare and ultra-rare indications in our lifetime, the lifetimes of our children, lifetimes of our grandchildren. And so we need some new models here. That $1 billion check, I would work through what we've already gotten started with the Buffalo Initiative, which is meant to be an evergreen fund as well as a clinical development capability that is nonprofit to be able to generate evidence in clinical trials of these assets and move them forward. It's evergreen, meaning that some of these assets, like any diverse portfolio, will reach commercialization. They will generate some financial return back to the fund to be able to fund the subsequent molecule. But by being in a nonprofit container, it's not beholden to shareholders that will require us to add a significant multiple on top of those returns. And so it is the perfect place for that $1 billion check to land, because we're not just going to consume that money and then come back for a second $1 billion. That $1 billion is going to kick off a portfolio of assets that will make that fund evergreen and help us create an engine on a platform-based approach to be able to bring more of those medicines through for these families, for these kids that deserve that opportunity.
So there's one more thing that I wanted to add. Rosa, as much as 1 billion is a large amount of money, in fact, it is not. Because the thing is that, if you think about the last couple of months, the announcement that has been made by pharma companies in the US in terms of how much, that they're going to invest in US R&D and manufacturing, the numbers has been totaled up. And there was an article in Wall Street Journal, it's like $350 billion. So, that's a kind of an earth-shatteringly large number. And, we're talking about even 1 billion, which is a fairly low fraction of what we're talking about. But since these fundamental things never get to a certain level of an X magnitude of an investment, these
Right.
very fundamental unblocking layers or levers never basically unlocks the big bottlenecks in the healthcare ecosystem. And then we go into this hamster mode, running the same problems all the time. So that's the thing that needs to be unlocked.
Okay,
In
quick,
here.
quick side anecdote. Back in the day when I was at Pfizer, I was relatively new there. I was sitting at the time with our chief technology officer and one of his direct reports. We were spitballing about this particular idea, and he said, let's play an exercise. Both of you write down on a piece of paper what it would cost to do this. I wrote down my number, $750,000. She wrote down her number, about $8 million. And he said, I think that's both right. I think that for someone that's been inside this company for a long time, it would cost us $8 million. And for someone outside this company, it would probably be about $750,000. So I have mad respect for the things our industry is doing. But I think we can go pretty darn far with that billion. I'm not too worried about that. But I do agree, Selin. Some of these things do cost a lot of money, but the cost of drug development doesn't have to be the dollar amount that it is. I
Right.
think there's this misnomer that we have, this misperception in the industry that what pharma spends to develop a drug is how much it costs to develop a drug. How much I spend includes my self-imposed taxes of extreme governance, extreme conservatism, extremes over and over again. What pharma pays is not necessarily what it has to cost. But you know that because you're hustling as an entrepreneur like nobody's business.
Exactly. Well, thank you both so much for the impact you are making. I'll be including your links in the show notes to find you on LinkedIn and to the causes and companies that are near and dear to your heart, since there are not just one for each of you. But Thank you so much for joining me on the Nurse Rosa's Insights podcast. If you are listening to this episode and you liked what you heard, please leave me a comment wherever you're listening. If it's on Spotify, Apple, or if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe. And if you know someone else with an at least billion-dollar idea to transform healthcare, feel free to point them my way. I'm on LinkedIn, but also on all the other social media platforms at Nurse Rosa Speaks, and you can reach me at nurserosaspeaks.com as well. And I will see you in the next episode. Bye.